Awesome, cool. Thank you, everyone. So for the next few minutes, I'll talk about a summary of discussions that we had at a summit that brought together fisheries practitioners and researchers around the Great Lakes to discuss broadly about how can we bring more underrepresented or underserved anglers into the conversation, into management practices. And if you were at my talk earlier today, we were giving this term as provisioning fishers and fisheries. If you weren't, I will give a bit of an overview, but you won't get the full gamut of it. So just to give a bit of context, I'll start off with just recreational fisheries in North America is often focused or conceptualized around sport fishing. So managers are really putting a lot of effort on game species, on managing sport and game species. And then recreational licenses play a role in funding fisheries management. And oftentimes, so addressing needs of the constituents is really important outcome. But oftentimes, these constituents are more vocal, have the capacity to advocate, and these folks are often in organized groups or have the means to do so, English speaking, et cetera. So it leaves a segment of the fishing population that I've said here are underrepresented or underserved in our management frameworks. Typically, from our work, we're seeing harvest-oriented anglers being a little bit less represented, rural anglers, immigrant and ethnically diverse anglers, economically disadvantaged anglers, and anglers with disability, among others, such as female anglers as well. And so that kind of was the premise of us thinking about this provisioning fisheries framework, and it brings forward essentially some of these values that we have sort of overlooked or is under-recognized in the recreational fishing space. So these values are overlapping and cut across like social, cultural dimensions, economic, food and nutrition, health and well-being, as well as livelihood and identity, et cetera. So with this framework, we just wanted to start a conversation about, there's all these other provisions, values, and benefits that we weren't really putting at the forefront when we discuss recreational fisheries, at least from the North American context. So this was published last year in Fisheries. But we do recognize that it's an academic, theoretical framework, so there's a need to kind of ground these in practice and also to match management needs with these questions. So my talk today is also a call to researchers to engage with some of these concepts and questions. So what we did is we held a summit in Windsor, Ontario, right at the border of near Detroit. It's a 1.5-day hybrid meeting. We had about 35 practitioners and researchers around the Great Lakes. They range from health practitioners, enforcement officers, fisheries managers, and academic as well as government researchers. The topics we wanted to explore were broadly, let's explore this concept and have an open dialogue of provisioning fishers and fisheries on how we defined it. Identify research and policy gaps, needs, and actions that could bring in more provisioning fishers into the conversation. And then lastly, to bring this all together and develop a practitioner-relevant research agenda for provisioning fisheries, but more broadly, it could be applied to more underrepresented anglers. So this could technically be downloaded on our site. I didn't put it on yet. I couldn't figure it out. But if you email me later, you can look at the report. And so jumping right into some of the results of our discussion, we had kind of mixed feelings about the term and the concept of provisioning fisheries. Some people really loved it. They thought it was a great term. It's ideal to capture that nuance of the fishery. It's not necessarily fishing for survival, not necessarily fishing for sport. So they loved it, but others were like, well, it's a little academic, it may not resonate well with the fishing community. And again, it could risk labeling fishers who may not want to be uncovered or they want to stay kind of under the radar. So there were some mixed feelings about it, but there was overall an agreement that there was a need for a flexible framework to have these discussions and to learn more about these fisheries and fishers. Here's just a quick quote from one of our participants who liked the term. So provisioning fisheries summarizes the difference between sport fishing and commercial fishing while also not having the all-encompassing nature of the term subsistence fishing, which suggests people only are eating fish. So we're talking about these other values that are non-material or less visible, such as cultural values, et cetera. So that's why they were saying this. We also asked practitioners about okay, what are some examples or what are some things now that you think are restrictive to these types of fishers, as well as what could be low-hanging fruit and opportunities. So barriers, the big one is obviously access and infrastructure, especially around shore access. Also inconsistent hours, so a lot of shore access is around parks, and municipal regulations are always like you gotta be out of there by dark or nightfall. Parking and facilities were an issue. Communication was also a big one. We talked about, I think Sean, you mentioned like even translating some of these surveys. So language, literacy barriers, uncoordinated messaging between health agencies and fisheries agencies. You know, people were getting confused. They're like, oh, well, I get to catch this many fish, but I can only eat like one of them, so it's kind of confusing for them. Lack of on-site information and just complex regulations generally were really a barrier to some of these fishers, especially newcomers who are sometimes maybe not used to all these regulations. Social stigma, power dynamics, so stereotyping and racism was pervasive in our conversations, but also distrust and shame among these groups of institutions. And lastly, again, fragmented governance and the representation of these fishers are lacking in institutional settings. But then there's also opportunities and low-hanging fruits of things that are already happening that could support these fishers and fisheries. For example, community-based outreach programs such as fishing ambassadors, cooking workshops showing how to cook fish that are less, least contaminating, I guess, or risky. Free fishing days, free shuttles to fishing sites that are cleaner, less urban. And we even witnessed like little freezers at cleaning stations where anglers who caught fish and wanted to share it with people in need could put it into a freezer so they can eat that after. Other things included just more multilingual and accessible communication. So Ontario has an interactive online fish consumption guide, QR code and signage at sites, and again, materials in multiple languages. We talked about infrastructure and access improvements. Things just as loaner rod programs are a good way to give fishers access to fishing. License waivers could be a possibility, and then just safety improvements overall in some of these shore access points. And then collaborative governance, so promoting representation, maybe even by compensating certain anglers who don't have the means to participate in these advisory groups, public input, even the ambassador programs. There's been lots of successes in ambassador programs driven by the community, which could be sort of scaled up. So the last part of my talk is just to present the agenda. It could be dry because there's a lot of questions. But the goal is to have, hopefully, researchers interested in this to engage with some of these research questions that were driven by these discussions with practitioners. So it is a relevant, practitioner-relevant research agenda. I was just writing it up as I came over to South Africa. So these are preliminary results. But broadly, after discussing for a day and a half, having practitioners submit research questions that was relevant to them, there were 4 broad themes: policy and governance, human dimensions, broadly like environment, ecology, conservation questions, human and health, nutrition was the 4th one. So what participants said about policy and governance were that, again, these fishers are generally absent from management and consultation processes. Policies right now tend to prioritize commercial and recreational fishing. There's lack of multilingual or culturally relevant information. There's a need to avoid conflict while also ensuring equitable access. And there was concern about further marginalizing some of these fishers because of climate change, urbanization, and shifting demographics. Some key questions raised were, do provisioning fisheries need formal management, and if so, how? What does inclusive, equitable governance look like? How can underrepresented groups be integrated into decisions? And how do enforcement experiences connect to systemic inequities? And I think these are questions that we're all also asking. In the conservation, ecology, environment space, I'm having trouble reading. The participants said there's significant ecological knowledge gaps, especially for non-sport, non-game species. Environmental changes are complicating site selection and fish abundance, so they want to know how it's affecting the anglers. Fishers' ecological observations are underutilized right now, and there's a need to build environmental conscious, resilient fishing community. Key questions raised included, how do climate change, invasive species, pollution, et cetera, affect provisioning fisheries? How will fish populations and fishing opportunities shift as ecosystems change? What are fishers' attitudes toward habitat protection and environmental stewardship? what ecological gaps exist around non-game species, and how are contaminants shaping harvest abundance and consumption choices. The health and nutrition topic, what participants said were that there needs to be clear, accessible information about contaminants, safe consumption levels, and then species-specific risks. Health advisories are often inaccessible because they're unilingual or too technical. There's mixed messages, as I mentioned, between the agencies, which is creating confusion, distrust, and health risks, and that this can undermine some of the cultural and mental health benefits of fishing. Key questions raised in this topic included what contaminants are most relevant and how much fish is safe to eat. How do health risks differ across species, water bodies, and demographic groups? How can agencies communicate risks without discouraging cultural practices or consumption? What barriers prevent fishers from accessing health information? And how can fish consumption guidelines be adapted to diverse cultural diets? And then lastly, the human dimensions was another one. That was all-encompassing. It was a bit broader, but what they said about under this theme was that there's, again, underrepresentation, a lot of power dynamics at play. Advisory spaces often miss culturally diverse, shore-based, and lower-income fishers. There's a lot of distrust in some of the communication, and many of these groups rely on informal networks such as diaspora groups, Facebook, tackle shops, libraries. And there seems to be lots of misperceptions around overharvest of some of these fishers that need to be addressed, and how can conflict be prevented. Questions raised included who participates, so what are their defining characteristics, how do they overlap across with other anglers, what species are harvested, including non-game ones, how much, with what gear, across which landscapes, what influences what fishers keep, such as motivations, regulations, and needs. How do fishers access, evaluate, and trust information? What is the most effective way to reach provisioning fishers? And how do power dynamics, representation, and interactions with other users shape safety, voice, and belonging? Sorry, I'm just reading the slide to you guys. And lastly, social cultural dimensions. So how cultural values influence fishing practices and outcomes and roles of, what's the role of provisioning fisheries in community well-being, informal and formal economies, and ceremonial practices. So those were the 4 broad topics with some of the questions highlighted here. And then we lastly asked, in the next 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see change in management? And it kind of divided in some of these 3 broad categories. So under governance and access, they would like to recognize provisioning fisheries, maybe not that term, but just somehow bring that more into the management framework. Enable inclusive decision-making and improve license accessibility, and support existing community-based programs. As I mentioned earlier, there's some great community-based programs that just need to be scaled up and supported. Topics on knowledge, research, and monitoring, expanding on non-game species, learning more about those fisheries would help, including fishers' ecological knowledge and observation into their stock assessments, et cetera. Conduct continuous contaminant and toxicity testing, and community-based safety monitoring, studies some of these nutritional needs and consumption patterns of these fishers, and revisit creel data from a provisioning fisheries lens, and perhaps adding socio-demographic and data collection in some of these creel surveys. And then lastly, there was a bunch on the engagement and communication side, which is obviously the delivering multilingual material, deployed tools such as apps, signage, pamphlets at the fishing sites, because these people are really hard to reach sometimes, and that's where you can reach them. Also, using events to reach some of these populations, such as workshops, derbies, festivals, co-producing guidance with community groups, and then lastly, just support environmentally conscious and resilient angling practices. Do I have a lot of time left? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to leave us here, but this is just a recap, and I will take any questions. Thank you.